so much for coming. We're very excited to be launching the inaugural series review Politics of Political Pageturners. So here to start us off tonight is Jill Lawrence. She is the author of The Art of the Political Deal, How Congress Beat the Odds and Broke Through Gridlock. So very timely, topical book for us all to
Yes, we can
discuss.
certainly clap. I have a cup in my hand. Wait a minute. We'll clap.
As we get into our discussion tonight, we hope you will follow us on Facebook Live and tweet at us using the hashtag #GUPageturners. So to introduce Jill a little bit, she is a commentary editor and columnist at USA Today. Jill was mentioning earlier that there's a piece coming out tomorrow about the current administration that should be very interesting, so look for that as well. She's written for Creator Syndicate, US News and World Report, and the Associated Press. She's appeared in newspapers from The Atlantic to the Daily Beast, Politico Online, so we have a real journalist and congressional expert with us. And with that, how fitting that Judy Bader, the McCourt policy and professor extraordinaire and former congressional candidate, will be moderating. So we have two very good thinkers in Congress and congressional policy with us tonight. So before I turn it over to Jill, just to refresh, she'll be discussing her book, The Art of the Political Deal, How Congress Beat the Odds and Broke Through Gridlock. It's based on 4 case studies she reported on and researched for Brookings Institution. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jill Lawrence.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I just want to say right off the bat that neither Judy nor I wore purple on purpose. But it is kind of appropriate since we're talking about compromise and negotiation. So you may have noticed that in the last decade or so, the country's become very polarized, and Washington is not thought of well. It's been at record lows in what people think, and even though President Obama managed to leave office with good approval ratings, Congress has just been sinking to new lows, and it was even at single digits at one point, and that is where my story begins. It was at 9% when our first deal got going in this book. This was a Congress that had brought us to the brink of default. It had brought us, one impasse after another on the budget, on spending, and it was in the midst of this that the American Political Science Association, for some reason, was coming up with criteria for what would make a negotiation successful. And there was one successful negotiation during this time, and it turned into the first case study for Brookings Institution. And the reason that it happened was Elaine Kmart was at a panel listening to Patty Murray talk about how she managed to get along with Paul Ryan. Patty Murray, one of the most liberal members of the Congress, the senator from Washington, and Paul Ryan, one of the most conservative members of the Congress, now the House Speaker. And somehow they found not just common ground personally, but common ground on policy. And they managed to get it done after years of failure, 5, 6 failures of different commissions and little groups of this, groups of 6, groups of 8, there was just one after another. So we decided to do a study of this, and it was that was the first case study, and then there were case studies also on the Veterans Deal, which actually took place in public and had some very high-profile cast members, including Bernie Sanders and John McCain, there were also cases that didn't feature really prominent people. You probably not even heard of a public lands deal that was over 160 pages, had dozens and dozens of moving parts, and some parts of it alone took 10 years to negotiate. And then there was a farm bill, which you may not pay any attention to at all, but it really bears on the price of the food you eat, and also a lot of where your tax dollars go. And so some of these players were not prominent, but the things they accomplished were really constructive. And so there was a lot of hand-wringing during the Obama administration, 8 years, even back into the Bush administration, 10 years of a lot of polarization. So it felt really good, and honestly it felt really important to be writing about success on Capitol Hill. And there are some problem solvers there. They were overcoming differences and obstacles and making things happen. And of course, nothing was perfect, and there was some backsliding. But the deeper I got into these cases, the more fascinating I found them, and the details, you know, the more details and the more sort of granular it got, the more fascinated I was. And also, the more I thought that some of this would be helpful, not just to congressional negotiations of the future, but to people in, you know, legislatures and on city councils, anyone in politics who's trying to get something done. So, while I was doing the reporting on these, the principles of the American Political Science Association were on the back of my mind the whole time. And you know, everything was kind of measured against, well, do they have this going for them? Do they have that going for them? And so these principles, one of the principles was nonpartisan fact-finding. You know, could you agree on the facts that you were basing your discussions on? And you know, I guess we're all so old, we remember when people trusted the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. And you know, a lot of people are trashing it now because of they don't like what it's finding, for instance, on the Republican health care bill. But people do pay attention to it. When it came out with the number on that bill that 24 million people might lose insurance, that was on front pages all over America, and Republicans are sure paying attention. So, you know, this is the gold standard of fact. And all four of these negotiations relied totally on the CBO. So that was one thing. Then another thing is what the political scientists call penalty defaults, which in plain language is the fear of failure. You know, what's the consequences for real people in your district, for your own political career? So this was a very powerful incentive in all four cases, and we can talk about that a little bit. Generally speaking, having a deadline was crucial. Having many deadlines was even better. Having many different kinds of deadlines was great, and it didn't even have to be a crisis. In some of these negotiations, the deadline was a recess, the last bill leaving the station before Congress adjourned, the legacy achievement that somebody wanted to get done before they retired or ran for a different office. So, and that was actually the hook for the public lands bill. You had a very conservative Republican congressman, the chairman of the Interior Committee, who wanted part of his legacy to be a Manhattan Project National Monument, which included, part of it was in his state at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation. So, and you also had Harry Reid in the Senate, who, this was in 2014, you could see the writing on the wall, he was going to lose the majority. He was not going to be the majority leader anymore. What he couldn't foresee was an accident that badly hurt him, and you know, just circumstances that would lead him to retire. But even the threat of just losing the majority and not having the power he had a bunch of things he wanted to get done in Nevada, both on the conservation and the development side, and he just put his people into the mix on the negotiations, and that was enormously helpful. And it was the first time some of these Republican staffers had ever met Harry Reid staffers.
Interesting.
Yeah, so and it was also very helpful in some of these cases that the chief negotiators of both the lawmakers and their aides knew each other and trusted each other. And in some cases, personalities were important, like when, you know, Patty Murray and Paul Ryan are nice people who like to fish and have good football teams that they like to cheer. And so this was quite helpful. Not a magic bullet, but a good tension diffuser when tension needed to be diffused. And I mean, one of the things that they talk about is how they kind of had these test runs where they would have breakfast or lunch, and nothing they said to each other would end up in the paper or you know, online. And so they knew by the time they were called on to do this budget agreement that they could trust each other. Debbie Stabenow, the senator from Michigan, is another person who drove negotiations with her personality, and she's not someone you hear a lot about. She's been called one of the most underrated senators, and I would have to agree with that. And I think that the case study on the Farm Bill proves the point. You know, talking to a Republican aides about her, you know, they called her an Energizer bunny who never missed an opportunity to make her points directly to them. You know, she'd go up to Republican staff members and talk to them, and they were shocked, but they thought it was fine. They thought it was good. And she was also, at least in the last part of that very long, drawn-out saga, working with Thad Cochran in Mississippi, who's a very old-school senator who came from the time when people got to know each other on both sides of the aisle and their staffs got to know each other. And he invited her to Mississippi. So you had this Michigan liberal and this very courtly Southern gentleman. And she made a great impression, and people got great write-ups when she was down there, and that told a lot about why this farm deal got done. So I think that the case studies, I don't know if any of you have read any of them, but it also made clear why, as a reporter, I could not be as transparent as I would have liked and as traditional news organizations would have required. I wanted to write a narrative. I wanted to tell a story of what happened and what both sides were doing and thinking and feeling. And I couldn't identify people and get on this material. I mean, that was the trade-off. I had to promise to protect everyone, and I did. And I think I was able to do that because I was writing for the Brookings Institution and not for USA Today or some other newspaper, which is sad, but that's just the way it had to be done. And I think the result made the methodology worthwhile, and we can argue about that if you like. So I was able to protect everyone's identities, and I have to hand it to them. By the time I was doing this, I was well known as a very liberal columnist, but I said there is no ideological agenda here. I'm doing straight ahead case studies. How did this get done? And I think one of the most striking, you can tell me. One of the most striking things that happened during the reporting was just realizing how long memories are on Capitol Hill. And you're seeing that now with the Gorsuch hearing. You're seeing Democrats just struggle and struggle to get past what was done to Merrick Garland. And in some of these studies, these Republicans on the public lands negotiations, when Obama first came in and they realized they had 60 votes and a Democrat in the White House, the Democrats took a 2-page bill about some kind of monument, and they turned it into hundreds of pages of wilderness areas and parks and monuments and historical sites, and Republicans had no say. And their view, the Democrats' view was, why would we bother talking to them? We have the votes we need. Let's just get it done. And so 5 years went by without a new wilderness area because Republicans gained control by and by, and they were pissed as hell. So actions have consequences and long, long tails. So that was a really interesting thing to find out. The psychology of establishing trust and breaking down some of those memories, bad memories, and it was really fascinating. And I do think that I was able to get inside these people's heads and figure out what they were resenting, things you would never think of if you read it and see what I'm talking about. It would never occur to you that they would mind X, Y, or Z, and yet they did. If somebody got up on the floor and said something that they were insulted by, or if somebody wanted to enlarge on something the president had done that they resented you'd done in the first place. I mean, there was just all kinds of stuff flying around, but they got past it all. The country is no less polarized now than it used to be. It's slightly different type of polarization because I'm not so sure, we haven't even gotten to the point of being polarized on policy. We're right now polarized over the president. Eventually the policy will come to bear and we'll see what's going on with that, but I think right now there's a lot of Republicans who would love to see Donald Trump out of office, and people who don't agree with Democrats at all on anything except that. There is one thing about Donald Trump. He prides himself in the deal, and I'd be lying if I said it was an accident that my book is called The Art of the Political Deal. And I'm sure he wouldn't blame me a bit for trying to get those SEO hits. But he likes deals as much as he says. There was a very interesting thing today where he and the Vice President Paul Ryan met with Zeke Emanuel, who was one of the architects of the Affordable Care Act. Who knows if he said anything that they will actually, do something with. But it was an interesting meeting to have had. So who knows? You know, maybe he will be a deal maker, and maybe Democrats will find something they like in some of the things that he wants to do.
So it is a great place to stop, I think, on a ray of hope. And I do note that Jill's cover, not only does she call it the art of the deal, but you've got a ray of sunshine coming
It's
through.
a sunrise. That was like the first thing, finding the cover picture.
I see.
And making sure that it was a sunrise and not a sunset.
Very important. So it's an optimistic, I would say, and you sound optimistic when you talk about it. So
I do. It's not easy.
But we don't have to go there immediately. We'll get there. I just thought it was nice to start with a sunrise and a ray of sunshine. And what I think is valuable about the case studies is your pursuit of the various elements that contribute to or may impede parties who disagree about a lot of things coming together. And I wanted to pick them apart a little bit, and I'm in a P mode, so I'm not covering all of of the pieces, but I liked alliteration. So I was thinking about pressure, which is the deadline and the consequences of failure. Privacy, which I think is where I want to start, that you're not, it's easier if you're not in the center of media attention. Prep work. Things don't emerge, as your case studies make clear, out of whole cloth. A lot of these bills have been, as you noticed in your opening remarks, have been going on for a long time. A lot of past history to look for there, and the effect going forward. I was thinking about in terms of parties being able to, the participants being able to listen to each other and come to agreement. Finding pluses for both of them, or wins, if you're not looking for a P, so that essentially you narrow the bounds in various ways, and we'll spend some time talking about that. And then I do think it's worth talking about the persistence of the deal, because you know in several cases that nothing happened. I mean, they passed a law and it didn't have, I'm thinking about the veterans case, that it didn't have the intended effect. So that's my take on just a few pieces to look at. We can pursue any of them, but I thought I'd start with the privacy issue, because it is, and our audience can let us know if they agree. There's a lot of belief in transparency and openness of the closing process, and that's supposed to be conventionally a good thing, but not necessarily. So I thought I'd ask you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I'm glad Sunshine Week is over, because this will not be an advertisement for transparency. One of the things that allowed Patty Murray and Paul Ryan to succeed in a budget agreement, whereas lots of other people had failed, was they were gone for a lot of the time. She was in Washington State, he was in Wisconsin, they were on the phone, they texted, you know, their aides were on the phone, their aides texted. There was none of this, you know, stakeout with 100 reporters outside the meeting room waiting for the puffs of smoke. So, you know, and that was a huge contrast to the veterans deal, which, just to briefly summarize, that was when there were two waiting lists being kept at some of the VA centers to hide the fact that some people were having to wait months to get in. And there was some fraud, and people died while they waited, although not necessarily because they waited, but it was not a good look for the VA. And so this was huge. You know, veterans are huge. Everybody wants to do right by veterans. And so every piece of this was chronicled, and the people that were involved, even the people who aren't necessarily usually prima donnas or, you know, histrionic, were getting really upset in public. And so you had, you know, Bernie Sanders and John McCain having a fight. You had Jeff Miller from the Florida Panhandle getting up on the floor with props and yelling and, you know, accusing people of moving goalposts, and you know, a real breakdown in civility, and everything, you know, that things that you would never suspect would aggravate the situation did. Like Harry Reid got on the floor and accused the Republicans of not wanting to spend money, but when Bush wanted money for the war, you didn't care about spending money, and they were like, oh, now.
Can't believe he mentioned that.
Well, the Republicans were like, you know, we're willing to spend money, but we're not willing to throw good money after bad, which you could make a big argument that that's what the VA was doing in many cases. So, But I mean, you could definitely see that both sides had their points. And then something as ridiculous as Miller calling for a meeting without asking Sanders first ended up in a conflagration and a very angry press conference and a Huffington Post headline, veterans deal falls apart, that's the end, it's over, But the aides, the faithful aides, were still talking. And, they were coming up against a recess. And who wants to go home and say you screwed veterans? Who wants to say you didn't do anything in their time of need? So it got done.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is that privacy helps because you're not every interaction is exposed. You're not always getting beat up by somebody for what you've done,
right.
But you can overcome it.
Well, the other, the public lands deal was another one where privacy was absolutely essential because there were so many parts of it that if anyone had heard that their part wasn't in, or that a part they didn't like did get in, or that something got changed, or that CBO said this about that, they could deep six the whole thing.
Yeah.
So it was very important, and they all kept the secrets.
So it's interesting about keeping secrets is an important piece, I think, also of trust that you mentioned. But I'm going to add a P, which is participants. Because you, I think, highlighted something in what you just said that it should be of interest to students. And that is the role of staff personnel, is for the participants or the personnel. And the ability of staff to keep things going when the going gets tough. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I really came away just feeling so good about the people who are the staff because they are really smart and they work hard. And, it falls to them to kind of be the calm underneath all the political posturing that goes on in public. And, they get bitter like anyone else, and they get frustrated. But what they all have in common on both sides of the aisle is their job to get things done. And so they get, for instance, when nothing's happening, when there's years that go by with no wilderness areas, it's tough on the people who want wilderness areas, but it's also tough on the people who want development, and it's tough on conservation, and it's in their interest to get things done in a win-win type of bargain, and so that was what drove things forward in large part in these cases.
The staff is a little bit forgotten. I'm sorry, everybody. The staff, I think, I don't know whether you encountered it, and I actually do think you mentioned it, but just as you talk about the relationships among members and that it's some of the personalities and whether they know each other at all, I think, did you find the same thing among staff? Because I would think some of that is true as well.
The staff, by and large, didn't really know each other.
They did not.
No, and
probably because some of them are so new.
Well, and it was, some of them had been there long enough to have been in a situation where there was some bipartisan negotiating. Some of them were working with, as I mentioned, Harry Reid staffers for the first time, and some of them were meeting someone like Debbie Stabenow for the first time. There was a lot of cross participation that was new in some of these areas, and that's because there's been so much polarization.
So they had to work together.
They had to work together.
Yeah. And do you think the staff built relationships in the course of the process?
There's a lot of turnover up there, and I know that some of the people who, were key to some of these agreements are now in different jobs. In fact, many of them move around a lot.
So if they don't stay, it doesn't do it.
Right, but they do, there are some long-standing things going on up there, but just like overall, they're the infrastructure that keeps things going.
Okay. All right, so I wanted to, before I go to bigger issues, I wanted to ask, and then we're going to turn to you. I'm not going to do this the whole time. Don't get nervous about that, okay? There's a few more minutes of this. I wanted to ask you about, I said a few minutes ago about that some of these deals didn't stick. So how do you feel about that comment on whether the fact that you get a deal, what makes it something that's going to stick?
Well, the deals are done in the best of intentions. If people really think they're going to do something worthwhile, and for instance, the big argument at the core of the veterans' negotiations was what's the role of the government in health care. And so you had Bernie Sanders on the one hand, the VA is the closest we have to socialized medicine, and he was perceived to be too often trying to make the VA look good.
And that he lets know he thought that was positive.
Right, well, right. He wanted to make them look good. He wanted to prove that this was the way to go. And the other side, the conservatives, think the private sector almost always has the better answer, and so they push really hard to, you know, to give as much private option to veterans as they could get. And, you know, there was a lot of push and pull over how much money for this and where to get the money. And as it turned out, you know, the VA hasn't had a lot of success in firing people, which is what the conservatives and some Democrats really wanted to do. It hasn't seen a lot of people turn to private care, which was very surprising given, you know, that there was this apparently unfilled demand to get appointments faster. You know, it's the management team that was there at the end of the Obama administration had great credentials and didn't make much headway. So, you know, and are they under-resourced? I don't think you can say that. They get what they ask for the most part. You know, there's a lot of talk about whether they should be specialized in combat injuries and, you know, brain injuries and that sort of thing, and just turn the rest of the veterans over to the general population, the general medical facilities. It didn't work out as planned, and they're still trying to figure it out. And what's really interesting is that Donald Trump kept an Obama appointee, the guy who was in charge of the hospitals. And so we'll see, you know, he must have been very impressed, or else he must not have been able to get anyone else to do it, because it does seem like a huge, thankless task.
So it's a big management task, and changing the legislation of the authority could be big.
And you know, as I say, it was counterintuitive. You know, there was a fear among the Democrats that people would rush to private care, and they didn't.
All right, so now let's look a bit bigger. You start, the book starts with one of the, I'd say, a deal around some of the most fundamental issues, which is the budget. And we talked about Patty Murray and Paul Ryan being able to come together. And there's a general theme about finding wins, letting, kind of walling off what you disagree with, or is most contentious for you, or finding a way to manage it, and finding wins for both sides. Talk about that as a theme of negotiating.
Well, the Farm Bill is an unusual bill because it has a food stamps component. And this particular Farm Bill took place during a presidential campaign when there was a lot of racially tinged rhetoric about the food stamp president and 47% and dependence and all this sort of thing. And so it wasn't really surprising that there was this huge package of amendments that conservatives in the House tried to get passed, including a work requirement and a drug testing requirement. So Debbie Stabenow struck down the drug testing requirement with a fabulous, you know, well, we can put that in when we require drug testing from the farmers to get ag subsidies. And in terms of the work requirement, what they ended up doing, if I'm remembering right, is they turned it into a pilot program. So it was a tiny thing, and it gave a win to the people who wanted it, and it wasn't, you know, onerous. We're seeing some of that come back now with Medicaid, and I'm not sure where that's going to go. But in this situation where you had Democrats and Republicans, they solved it by making it a pilot program.
So it seems goes with the rest of your story that there was enough pressure to agree that they could find a way to get the win without imposing a substantial loss on the Republicans.
Right, and the same thing with the amount of food stamps. The House passed a $40 billion.
Oh, I don't remember. Yes,
in food stamps, and it ended up at 8, and that was largely because Thad Cochran, you know, the Senate is always a moderating force because these people are covering whole states, and you know, they represent whole states where there's a lot of people who depend on these programs, and he, you know, people said way on background, you know, he never was on board with 40. You know, he was always going to go with 8. But now the Senate Democrats have gone with 4. So, you know, that's more of a win for the Democrats, I think, but it was a compromise. I mean, numbers are really the easiest thing to come up with.
Yeah, well, you start splitting differences,
right?
And whatever.
Exactly.
But all right, so let's go from the past to the future before we open it up. In the current legislation on the table, as you mentioned with Medicaid, is the repeal and replace of the Affordable Health Care Act. The Affordable Care Act. And the question, a good question, this is a big one, it's hard to, there's a lot of opposition both within the Republican Party and across party lines. So what lessons do you think would you draw from what you did for what we expect to see, or how you would negotiate the American Health Care Act?
I'm not sure there's a way to negotiate that one. I'm really not.
Too big to wall off.
I mean, I think there's going to have to be negotiations that apply some of these principles within the Republican Party if it's going to get out of either chamber. I'm not sure it's going to get out of both. Maybe it will, but I mean, the thing is, you know, they talk about a three-pronged approach, but only one of the prongs requires a simple 51 vote majority. They might be able to get to that on the promise of doing more for the people who are going to get left behind in this original prong. But the rest of it means 60 votes, and they will never get that unless they just, you know, repass.
But within the Republican Party, you can see some of what you talked about going forward. The trying to hear the conservatives and the moderates at the same time, and you know.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a complicated negotiation.
Nobody knew how complicated healthcare was.
What a shocker.
It is my field.
And I've written reams about it.
It's
you know, there are people who think that this is a betrayal, this law, this bill, because it's not a simple repeal that just puts things back where they were. And there are other people who think it's a betrayal because 24 million people are going to get kicked off insurance or not have insurance, and older people.
Yes.
Older people will have to pay a lot more than they've been paying. So, you know, it's, I don't see where the middle is on this. I do think they might get to 51 in the Senate, but they'll never get to 60 for the rest of what they need to do.
All right, so that is, it's so big you can't find win-wins is what we're talking about. And that's asking for fundamental compromises of core values, core principles. And not so good for compromise. So what about another simple issue? We got the budget coming up. The continuing resolution runs out at the end of April. We've already last week where the debt ceiling, we hit the debt ceiling,
yeah.
Although they have until the end of summer to use extraordinary measures. So what do you see on the horizon for the budget?
I mean, the two issues you brought up are issues that really go to the heart of the differences between the parties and their priorities and how they want to get to where they're going and where they want to go in the first place. So, I mean, ask me about infrastructure.
Talk about it.
I mean, I think there's a potential.
It's important to think about where your windows of opportunity are and where they are.
That's a window. I mean, it's a window because everyone wants to get to the same place on this. They have different ways of getting there, and so if they reduce the tax incentive part of what Trump wants to do and add more direct spending, which Democrats want to do, maybe they get to some place where they can do it. Now, is this going to be a top priority? I don't know, but it is something that people have been talking about for 10 years that they want to do. I mean, ever since the recession, it's been out there as some way to make sure people get jobs. It could definitely help people in Trump country, you know, people who are looking for jobs. So maybe it'll get done. Tax reform is another place where there may be some common ground if people want it bad enough. It's, you know, a lot depends on Trump. You know, does he want the deal? What's he willing to give up for the deal?
Hey, it's a good place to leave that one. That was sufficiently optimistic and limited in optimism. You did good. Okay, and so why don't we open the floor and see what comments, questions people in the room have? Yeah.
I would like to ask about a different keyword, personalities. In these deals, there were certain personalities behind the deal makers, and in one case, with regard to Ryan, I see it as John Boehner. With him out of the picture, where he sacrificed himself the month after Pope Francis appeared before the Congress, without a John Boehner around, how could you come to the same kinds of compromises?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, John Boehner had a nice personality, but you know, he never managed to do the grand bargain with Obama. even though Obama was willing to compromise on a core principle there on Social Security, he was willing to reduce Social Security cost of living increases. Also, Boehner, for all of the storm and fury over food stamps, Boehner was so worked up over a dairy program in the Farm Bill that he's the one who held it up. So, personalities can be deceiving.
But he wasn't a prince, he was another Peter.
Right. I mean, he was in the budget negotiations because both he and Harry Reid decided to let Patty Murray and Paul Ryan do it themselves. They did not interfere, and that was very helpful. So, in his absence, he did really well.
So wouldn't you say, just to follow up on that a little bit, wouldn't you say that Paul Ryan has an enormous amount riding here and he needs to bring the caucus together? Is that what, I don't know.
Well, he's the speaker now, so he doesn't have the backstop of anybody above him.
Well, that's
He's the
true.
deal, he's trying to make this, push this forward.
It's his agenda, whereas Boehner could help him, is what you're saying. Got it, okay.
Well, I think, everyone's been talking about him as the brains of the conservative movement for a long time, but the things he wanted to do never had support in polls or
Nor from the Congressional Budget Office.
Right, or from Republican governors in states that, are kind of shuddering now about what might happen to them as a result of his policies. So, it is a real moment of truth for Paul Ryan, but I don't think it has to do with personality.
Other questions?
Yeah?
So for the last 8 years, it's kind of the Republican strategy to just obstruct, like McConnell said, our top priority is to deny Obama a second term. And electorally, at least, it worked for them because now they're back in power with pretty significant majorities. Do you think that's a bit of a motivating force for like the resistance, say just like resist, obstruct, etc., and eventually we'll be back in power?
For Democrats?
Yeah.
I mean, it was really strange to be writing this book at this moment because, I understand the instinct of Democrats to want to resist. You can see from the book that Republicans did not succeed in resisting entirely. I mean, there's the business of government that has to get done occasionally. And so, there may be Democrats who compromise on the budget or on an infrastructure bill or something like that. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me at all if no Democrats voted for Gorsuch just because of how horribly they were treated last year. So, I think that that's something that they're going to have to work out, and there's a lot of disagreement in the party about how to deal with it. But to some extent, I think the problem of the Democrats more has to do with infrastructure at the state and local levels of government, and coming up with talented candidates and who can work their way up.
So it's more than just the position relative to the current party. It's the whole used infrastructure another way. The underlying party operations in the states. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it may also be that they'll be helped by the Republican agenda in action because it's not popular.
Other questions? Yes.
So you mentioned earlier about the whole lunch run that they would do, like dinner together.
The whole, I couldn't hear you.
Trial run, like they would eat lunch and breakfast together because they were weeks. In your research, did you find that leaking and leaks had any significant influence on like eroding trust or eroding negotiations?
These were negotiations that worked.
Yeah.
So there weren't leaks.
Right.
So I mean, these were kind of exceptions to that. I actually don't remember anyone talking about leaks because some of it was done in public, but the stuff that was done in private that needed to get done in private really was. And what we're seeing now with this administration is just astonishing in terms of the leaks. And you have to think that some people feel like they really need to do this for their consciences. This is not normal, having leaks like this.
Oh, I don't know. I was in the early Clinton administration.
Oh, well, yeah,
like I said,
you're
all
right.
that.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm used to the Obama administration, which is pretty tiny.
But tie the issue of no leaks to trust and objectives, that they've got some goals. I mean, it seems to me that the circumstances when leaks would happen, circumstances would affect when the leaking would occur.
occur. Well, when people have enough at stake, for instance, that public lands bill, it was very big and very under the radar, and the only way to get it done was to put it onto another bill. That was the last bill that Congress had to pass before they left town in December, I think, of 2014. And it was only going to be allowed onto that bill if every single part of it was approved ahead of time and nobody was going to object to anything. And so that was very difficult, and they had to come up with a whole defensible way of narrowing down what they included, because there were hundreds and hundreds of bills in that 5-year period when nothing got done. People were just introducing things, and they had to figure out how to cut it down in a way they could defend it. And
plenty of members that they would antagonize by people. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so they had to have a rationale. And they were, you know, and they also were talking about how every time they changed one piece, they had to go back to CBO, and then everything would change. You know, all the numbers would change, and so they were constantly rejiggering and going back to the drawing board. So it was always changing, and they were shocked that they were able to do it secretly. They were shocked that none of it got out, but they knew that if any of it had, that there would be a line of special pleaders at the door, and it would just be all over.
So because they were committed to the process, they all had a stake in keeping it quiet.
That's right. It was like the vow of silence.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Jill, you talked earlier that you had to violate every single name, sources, rule of journalism to get the story. At a point when journalism is doing a lot of rethinking, should major institutions rethink the way they cover Congress to get at real stories like that?
You know, the way I did this was to ask forgiveness and not permission. I just did it the only way I thought it could be done. And God bless her, Elaine Kmart never said, we need to get all these people's names.
No, because as a political scientist, we don't have to do that. We're not journalists.
Thank God. I mean, you know, there's no way to say, trust me, and then know ahead of time they can trust you. When the pieces were written, nobody complained. No one said, you got that all wrong. People seemed quite pleased with the way, with the accuracy of how it was depicted. I don't know that a regular newspaper could do it like this. And it's a shame, because I don't see any other way to have gotten this level of detail and this level of honesty. I mean, do you? I mean, I just don't see how it can be done. And it's.
I'm just wondering whether it's time for certain types of coverage to just throw out every rule out the window, except for fairness and accuracy.
Yeah. Don't you think some of that has already happened? It doesn't seem to me it was always true that news articles said when they're handling a leak, essentially, say, unless I've forgotten what the wording, but it's something like, and his name could not be used because he wasn't authorized to speak on this issue. Every time I read the phrase, I'm thinking, yeah, I mean, that's obviously, but we didn't used to see that.
There was one in the New York Times which has been framed. So-and-so declined to speak because she always wanted to be an off-the-record source.
But wasn't that a change?
Yeah, I mean,
that was a change, but it was sort of lame.
It was the rule was to give somebody the ability to speak off the record.
But you had to say why.
You have to say why. And the why is often because they didn't want to.
Exactly.
But again, there is ways of, I think, doing these stories, like the case studies, where it's much more narrative and much fewer blind quotes. That I think that what readers object to are, Harry Reid was so full of it, said an unnamed Republican aide, as opposed to on Wednesday they met together and they accomplished this part of the bill.
I mean, I have to have faith that there is some reason that we think that there's less faith in the media because of unnamed sources. And certainly the president has been milking that. I don't see that a mainstream news organization could go the path that I went for a think tank. I just don't think it's possible. And probably not, I wouldn't recommend it. But there is, you know, a case to be made for other types of journalism funded by other types of institutions, maybe, where you can get at this. Or you can write a book and do it however you want and let the public judge whether you're